All right, everybody, I think we'll be getting started here. We'll let people finish through the line. Before starting, I'd like to take a moment to honor the memory of Purva. For those of you that don't know, Purva died in a car accident this weekend. And I knew Purva going back to early mornings with LRW. We worked very closely with the ILJ supplement this past year. Purva's positive outlook on life was infectious, and her smile could light up even the darkest days spent in the library. We were all lucky to know her, and our thoughts now turn to her family and all of her loved ones. If you wouldn't mind joining me in a moment of silence for Purva. All right, we'll get underway now. My name is Christian Townsend, and I'm the former president of IU Mauer's chapter of the Federalist Society. I'm filling in for James Collins, who's sick, which means that I have complete reign and I can do what I want. The Federalist Society is a nationwide network of judges, scholars, lawyers, and law students who believe that the idea of carefully circumscribed judicial powers is just as important today as it was for our founders. Through the Mauer chapter and others across the country, we promote and encourage public debate on key constitutional legal issues. Today we're excited to welcome Professor Josh Blackman from the South Texas College of Law in Houston and IU's own Professor Steve Sanders. They'll be discussing freedom of speech on college campuses. The way the format will work is Professor Blackman will talk for about 20 minutes, and Professor Sanders will offer about a 10-minute response and conversation, with time at the end for questions. So begin thinking about what you'd like to ask. Let me introduce today's speakers. Professor Blackman is an associate professor of law at the South Texas College of Law at Houston, who specializes in constitutional law, the United States Supreme Court, and the intersection of law and technology. Professor Blackman is the author of Unprecedented, the Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare, and Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power, as well as over 4 dozen law review articles. His commentaries appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today, LA Times, and other national publications. His latest book, which he co-authored with Professor Randy Barnett, is an introduction to constitutional law, 100 Supreme Court cases everyone should know. Professor Blackman was selected by Forbes magazine for the 30 Under 30 in Law and Policy. He's twice testified before the House Judiciary Committee and is an adjunct scholar at Cato Institute. He's also the founder and president of the Harlan Institute and the founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, the internet's premier Supreme Court fantasy league.
You should
all blogs at joshblackman.com. Professor Steve Sanders teaches constitutional law, family law, constitutional litigation, conflict of laws, and seminars on constitutional interpretation and judicial review here at Mauer. His scholarship focuses on questions arising out of the 14th Amendment, its guarantees of equal protection and due process, with a special focus on issues affecting LGBTQ persons and same-sex couples. His work has been cited by, among others, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Federal District Court opinions, and briefed to the United States Supreme Court, and numerous other courts. He has been designated a Henry H. Remark Distinguished Scholar by IU's Institute for Advanced Study and has been recognized with an IU Trustees Teaching Award and by vote of the law students as Outstanding Interactive Professor. Please welcome our speakers.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And my good friend Steve, you are so lucky to have him on your faculty. He's not just smart. He's open-minded, and I mean that in every respect. He listens to people he agrees with, and he listens to me, who he disagrees with on most things, but we get along, I think, quite well. We've done this dog and pony show a few times before. I won't say who the pony is, but we get along very well. The topic today is an issue that really should not split on left-right lines, but unfortunately does. And that's the issue of free speech on campus. Usually when I come to a law school to talk about a topic, I can be dispassionate because we can talk about issues in theory. But this is an issue that's very close to me. About a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now actually, I spoke at the CUNY Law School in Queens, New York. Just like I'm talking to you. And the topic that I was invited to speak about was the importance of free speech on campus, just like the topic Steve and I are talking about today. Except you are very different from those students. You are sitting here, listening intently, ready to ask questions. They were a little bit eager. In fact, they protested me. They heckled me. They tried to stop me from speaking. I'll play some clips in a few minutes, but I want to bring you up to speed that not all law students think views they disagree with should be heard. And many of these law students thought that the solution or the remedy to me being on their campus was to shout me down and ensure that I cannot be heard. Now, thankfully, no one's yelling at me yet. So let me give you some background. This is a Federalist Society event. You're all here. You're enjoying the free food, and you're enjoying a speaker. The Federalist Society sends speakers to law campuses across the country, and we do this for a lot of reasons, one of which is to maybe expose students to different ideas, but also give students perhaps perspective that they think about and maybe aren't reflected in their own faculty. I think you're lucky. I think someone like Steve gives you every range of ideas. He was asking me this morning about a case he's going to teach, and that's a testament to his open-mindedness. But not every campus has that kind of breadth of opinions. So a few days before the event, I got an email from the student chapter president who invited me. He said, "Josh, we passed out flyers, and students are already up in arms, and they're planning a protest." Now, I didn't believe them. I thought, no way, I am not nearly important enough to protest. There's no way they're going to waste your time. Because who cares? It's a law professor now, right? You come, you go to class, it doesn't really matter. But then, I got a couple more emails saying that things are starting to get a little bit more serious. And then I arrived at the campus, and the school security officer came over to me and talked to me for a few minutes. Like, all right, whatever, no big deal. And then he asked me a question that I never considered before. He asked me, "What is your exit strategy?" Was Iraq? What is my exit strategy? He says, "How do you plan to leave the building?" I was like, "I don't know, I'm going to take an Uber." He's like, "Okay, good, you're not going on the subway." Oh. And then it clicked that this guy was legitimately concerned about my safety, that if there was some sort of protest, look, things can turn violent. Now, thankfully that didn't happen. I won't tease you with that. That didn't happen. There was no violence. But I do want to play a few minutes of this video, and I'm going to pause throughout. So the scene here is me walking to the classroom, which is usually uneventful. Usually I walk in the front door, I leave my suitcase in the corner, and I sit down, no one bothers me. But this was a little bit different. Okay.
Hey guys.
By the way, that sign, your legal analysis is lazy and wrong. I kind of agree. That one says fuck off. That one, okay, whatever. In fact, that says fuck off. The one behind it says conservative hate does not equal intellectual debate. And there are all these signs calling me a white supremacist, and calling me a Nazi, and calling me a fascist, calling me a sexist, racist, homophobe, bigot, transphobe, ableist. Every name you can think of was on those signs, which I have no problem with, actually. Believe it or not, I'm okay with this, right? I have zero problem whatsoever with signs shouting me names, calling me this or that. That is their free speech rights. And I would not for a second criticize the people in this hallway. They had deeply held, sincere beliefs about me, which may be right or wrong. That doesn't matter. That's fine. They made my life uncomfortable, right? For me to walk through the hallway, it was not pleasant. I mean, look, I'm not complaining. I'm a tenured law professor. I have a job. That's not my purpose here. But it's very effective to use speech to make someone feel uncomfortable when they're on your premise, when they're on your campus. So this is completely fine. I have no objection. Okay? Let me keep playing the video.
On you! Shame on you!
Now, this guy with the backpack, let me pause. He made a half-hearted effort to block my entry. That's a different story. He's standing right in front of the door with his backpack. That was very deliberate. I had to kind of nudge him to the side, but that was the closest I came.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
Now, what's going on here, right? The room's empty. There were about, I don't know, 40 or 50 protesters. I did not get a good count. But there were like, what, 4 or 5 people inside the classroom. Right? Okay, I thought, all right, fine. They protested me in the hallway. I get to do my show.
Shame on you! 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 Shame on you!
So I saw here.
But then they started getting and they're standing right behind me. So as close as this screen is to me right now, they were standing behind you. Now we're starting to get a little bit more dicier. When people are standing behind you, you can't see them. And that sounds really obvious, right? But when someone's behind you, it creates a threat, right? Because you don't know what they're up to.
So we're going to ask you please to stay to the side or in the back. The front is reserved for the speakers.
Pursuant to.
So I can go get Steve Cass or a dean.
What's going on now is the students don't want to move away from the front of the classroom, right? They want to share the front of the space with me. I don't say a word, right? I realize that they're going to do what they want to do. I can't stop them, so I'm going to try to be conciliatory.
Directly affected by every fucking you. Legal objectivity is a myth. You still have an opportunity to leave.
No, it's not ready. So thank you guys for coming. We're here to introduce Professor Josh Blackman from the South Texas College of Law. He's here today to discuss the topic of freedom of speech in the context of university. Professor Blackman has written numerous articles on numerous constitutional topics, and he's given this speech many times before. Thank you. And so, Professor Blackman, everyone's decided to stay.
He's filming us. Just so everyone's aware, he's filming us. He's filming us.
Well, thank you very much to CUNY for having me.
He's not having you. He's not having you. White man and Josie.
Right, so they start talking over me, right? And that's a significant change, right? This sounds obvious, but only one person can talk at a time, unless they're on cable news, right? If people are talking over each other, there's no actual dialogue going on. So the second they start to interrupt me, I think that's when their free speech rights start to become very tenuous. I'm open to being persuaded that standing behind me is protected speech. I can go back and forth, but when they're talking over you, sustained, I think at that point, the argument shifts a little bit.
Everyone's decided to stay.
He's filming us. Just so everyone's aware, he's filming us. He's filming us.
Well, thank you very much to CUNY for having me.
He's not having you. He's not having you. White men and Josie support white supremacy.
I'm not white. I'm not white.
Then white men support white supremacy.
Excuse me.
What's going on here is actually fascinating. They called me a white supremacist, and they called those who were in the audience for me white supremacists. And then there was an African-American kid sitting in the back who said, I'm not a white supremacist. And they said to him, why are you here watching this guy? And he basically says, I want to hear what he has to say, which I was actually relieved there's at least one person in the room who wanted to hear what I
I think it was already explained to you that you're not supposed to disrupt the speaker once he starts.
All right, so this is an important point, right? At this point, we're about 4 minutes into the video. I said 3 words, thank you for having me. And I guess, thank you for having 4 words, okay? And then a dean walks in, the associate dean. She walks in, and she tries to lay down the law. What she basically says is, you can't interrupt him, and if you do, I'll be back. She doesn't say what punishment will happen, she says, I'll be back. Narrator, she never came back.
Listen, everybody stop. Let me tell you something. The university rules are, people get to speak. You may protest. You may protest, but you may not keep anyone from speaking. If you do, I have other things to do. I will be back. Or you can resolve this yourself. Or you can have me resolve it.
Why are you bringing racism to your school? Can you answer that? Why haven't you provided support for students who are affected by this hate speech? You're not children, you can't talk to us.
We're not children, you can't talk to us this way.
Who invited you? Like
CUNY, the CUNY Federalist chapter.
they have a Federalist chapter.
Yeah, and to their credit, look, the administration didn't do much, but at least they did not uninvite me. So I give them that much credit. All right.
Please don't take the bait.
What's going on now? So there's a professor in the back who's with the protesters, and he's telling them, "Don't take the bait." What does that mean? They thought that I came to campus to bait them. In other words, to basically make them work into a frenzy and then embarrass them, right? To draw attention to them. I guess this is like a self-inflicted wound. But they thought I was baiting them, which I'm not. I give this talk everywhere.
Oh my God. Don't take the bait.
And she is threatening you guys. It's ultimately her choice whether she wants to do something. It's not our choice.
Alright, so at this point I sense things starting to quiet down, and I'm not yelling at them, right? I'm not screaming at them, right? I'm not telling them, you little snowflakes get lost, right? I'm not doing that, because I knew that would backfire big league, right? If I may. So I'm just sitting there quietly. So then I try to say a few words.
So, for those of you who are actually here to hear me speak, I'll try. When I came today, there was a sign handed around that says, "Oppressors are not welcome." And it says at the bottom, "We reject the idea that his views, my views, merit space on this campus, and reject the myth of legal objectivity. Josh Blackman is not welcome at CUNY Law. Congratulations, you made me feel not welcome, but I'm still going to say what I'd like to say." Thank you, I tried. So, I actually want to start by using the one legal argument you actually made. You said,
So what happened was, they actually created what I call opposition research. They put out these flyers with all these things I've said and done, completely out of context, to try to shape me in a certain way. It was actually, they did their homework. They actually went through my YouTube and my Twitter and found like obscure things and said, here's what he said, and completely out of context, right? But they focused a lot of my work on DACA. Now I take a position on DACA that's not conventional. I think DACA is an excellent idea, but I think the executive action is unlawful. I think the president can suspend it. I think that's within his rights to do. I think the Supreme Court will probably agree with me in a couple months. But I want to talk about DACA, so watch this.
the violence exists in the law, and it's a myth that law is inherently neutral. Okay? You said there's a myth of legal objectivity. So let me talk about legal objectivity for a few minutes, right? Someone did some excellent opposition research. Whoever did this, I actually applaud you. You found about 7 or 8 bullets on various videos I've given over the years. But I want to make a few points. For example, you wrote that I supported the president's decision to rescind DACA. Now let me tell you something. I actually support the DREAM Act. This might surprise you. I actually think the DREAM Act is a good piece of legislation. And we're a member... Well, let me speak, please. And we're a member of Congress. I would vote for the DREAM Act. My position is that the policy itself was not consistent with the rule of law, which teaches a lesson, right? The lesson is this. You can support something as a matter of policy, but then find that the law doesn't permit it. And then the answer is to change the law.
Fuck the law.
You hear that?
A law student at a law school.
That's when I knew I had them. They had nothing left to say. All they could say was "fuck the law." That was it. They were toast. I was like, okay, now I'm in business. Because at a certain point, the protest breaks down. They have nothing left to do. They realize I'm not the guy they thought I was, and all they can do is say "fuck the law." Law students, fuck the law.
Fuck the law, right? That's a very good thing. You are in law school, right? And it's bizarre to say "fuck the law" when you're in law school.
You chose to, didn't you? Because you knew what would happen if you came here.
Well, if you let me speak, So fuck the law, right? That's a good mantra, fuck the law.
How many of them?
You
do. And I'm actually very impressed. Let me say this. I'm actually impressed that there's so many of you. You could be anywhere right now, and you chose to come out here and exercise your constitutional rights. You want to exercise your rights, and I'll do the same.
Because they're not acting right.
And I'm here the same, so I'm going to express my views. So let me go down this list you have. You have this little checklist, right? I think DACA. Oh, please leave, by all means. I think DACA is a good policy.
I think you're tired.
No, I'm doing pretty good.
You're lying to yourself.
Okay. Oh, that.
This is really about CUNY law and how you let this happen. And shame on all you for being here. How could you let that happen?
I will support that.
All right, I'm gonna stop it now, and I'm gonna give a summary of what happens after this. I'll give Steve some time to comment as well. But this is like, if I had to create a controlled experiment to illustrate free speech on campus, I could not have done better than what actually happened to me, right? There are a lot of things that are going on here. So first, we have the question of who gets to invite people on campus? And actually, Steve asked me this exact question, anticipating my very first comment. Who gets to invite people? I think as a general matter, especially in a public university like this one, student groups should have the autonomy to invite speakers on their own. I don't think students should have to get permission from an administration to invite speakers, precisely because that can give rise to, I don't want to say censorship, because that's the wrong word, but the administration could encourage certain types of speakers and discourage others, what you might call viewpoint discrimination, perhaps. I think generally, if students have the funds and the wherewithal, they can bring in speakers. There's always availability of outside funding for groups, and that does exist in certain contexts. But I think as a general matter, students should be able to invite whomever they wish. That's the first one. I think on that point, I think we're fairly non-controversial. There are schools that don't have that policy. Some schools require administration approval for any speaker to be made. I don't think that's the case here. No, it's definitely not on a state campus. But it's the private schools that is the policy. They're not bound by the First Amendment. It's private colleges. They have maybe academic freedom norms, but that's within their constitutional prerogative. The second question that I want us all to think about today is, once a speaker is invited and he's on campus, what constitutes a disruption? That is not an easy question. It really is not. And let me give you a couple ways to think about it, right? When I was walking down the hallway and they're all shouting at me and screaming at me, holding up signs, calling me names, that's fine. That is not a disruption. They made me feel a little uncomfortable. That's on me. But let me put this question to you. If you were going to give a speech somewhere and you knew that there were 50 people in the hallway screaming and shouting at you, would you still do it? Or would you turn around and say, screw this, not going to waste my time? And you have to, I don't want to say show of hands. It's a hard question. You're a law student, maybe you don't do a lot of public speaking, but there might come a point in your career where you're taking some unpopular position, whatever it happens to be, and your host tells you, look, there are like 50 people there shouting and screaming at you. If you want, you can bail, or you can walk through. Right? So there's a chilling effect, no doubt, but I'm okay with that. I think speech is good. They want to scream at me and curse at me, that's fine. As long as they don't touch me, right? That one guy I mentioned tried to block the door. I don't think he was actually trying to, but I think he kind of put his backpack to try and give me a hard time. I said, nudge him. Okay. So what constitutes disruption? The screaming in the hallway? Fine. Okay, what happens if that screaming in the hallway before the event? There are 50 people standing right there by that door screaming. And those doors don't look very thick to me. And that sound would permeate in, without a doubt, right? What if they're screaming outside the room? And they're screaming so loud that I can't be heard. Or maybe your questions can't be heard, or Professor Sanders can't be heard, right? Is that a disruption? Okay, let's try a different one. What happens if you have 20 people in the back row holding up signs saying, Josh, you're evil? Right? I'm sure those signs exist somewhere, right? That's fine. I mean, I have to look right at them and see them hold that message, but I don't think it's disruption. Now, what if they get up in the front of the classroom, right in front of this podium, right over here, right in front of Professor Sanders, right, and hold up signs blocking us? Or what if they put their hand over the projector to block my PowerPoint, right? Well, that looks more like a disruption. Now, if they stand behind me, now, they're not blocking our visual connection, right? I can see you, you can see me, but they're right behind me. And let me tell you something, that can be a little intimidating. Thankfully, this did not come to violence, and I want to make that point very clear. But my dad, when he saw this video, was almost crying. He's like, Josh, you can never do this again. You can never speak ever again. They could have attacked you. They could have. I don't think the CUNY kids want to engage in violence, but things can turn ugly quickly. All right, so if they're saying behind you is that disruption. All right, so now we get to the question of how much heckling amounts to disruption. What if I'm speaking and I say something very incendiary, and someone starts going boo, hiss, right? So like a limited utterance. I may not like it, but I'm not gonna flip out over that. I think that might be okay. What if I say something very controversial and someone says, "How dare you?" or "Explain yourself," or "What about X?" Right? Like a short, excited question. Now, usually you do Q&A at the end. That's usually the format. But I think I might be okay with a short question. But when you have sustained interruption, where they're just talking over me, shouting at me, that gets more problematic. But here's the question. How long? Right? I had an hour, and they protested about 7 or 8 minutes, depending on how you count it. Does a 7-minute interruption for an hour talk amount to a disruption of my rights? Now, the dean of the CUNY Law School basically said no. She said because it's only disruption for 7 or 8 minutes out of an hour talk, there was no disruption. I think that's problematic. I had a specific talk I wanted to give. It took a certain number of minutes. I could not give that talk. Indeed, I abandoned my talk once I got, screw this. After the protesters left, you know what I did? I took Q&A for an entire hour. Whatever questions they had, like ask me anything, literally. Abortion, criminal justice, right? Fourth Amendment, environmental law, anything they wanted, originalism, slavery, whatever they wanted to ask me, I took their questions. I felt like I was an ambassador from a foreign country, like bringing information they've never seen before. I felt like I was like an interloper. But I took every question. And let me show you at the very end. So the classroom's empty, right? At the beginning. It fills up. By the end, there are 40 or 50 people there. Why? Here comes the scary part. Several of the students told me that they were embarrassed and afraid to be seen with me because they didn't want to have pressure from their classmates. That if they were voluntarily seen going in there, they'd be associated with the white supremacists, and they wanted to avoid it. So they waited till the protesters left, and they all sort of trickled in as the hour went on. But I answered the questions for a good hour. Whatever questions they had, I had no problems. Now, there was this one guy in the back, so the guy with the long hair holding up a sign, and the sign says, Josh Blackman is an oppressor. That's me, Josh. And let me tell you something. He must have asked me a dozen questions about everything. I can't even remember. Just a wide range of questions. And I gave him my card after the event. I didn't think anything would come up, but I gave him my card. And then I get an email from that evening. And the email, I'll never forget the phrasing. He said, "Thank you for coming." He said like this, "I no longer have enough evidence to conclude that you are an oppressor." Like, I've rebutted the presumption of oppressiveness, right? That I was able to shift the burden, so to speak, away. But why? Because he heard me speak. He listened to me for a good hour, and he's like, I've been holding with signs saying this guy is an oppressor. Maybe he's not an oppressor. But I can't disprove it. I just don't have evidence to support it. And that was an important move, right? The fact that he actually heard a contrary view and came away learning something about it, I think is wonderful. Okay, so whether there's disruption, I think there probably was, but I can persuade otherwise. The third question is one where I usually have the hardest time making the case. If there is a disruption, what is the proper discipline? In other words, those people who stood at the front of the class for 8 minutes or so, what should happen to them? And you can consider this a public school or a private school. I think it's at a public school, the students have free speech rights as well. At a private school, the dynamics are a little bit different. Should they have been punished? I don't think they should have, but they could have been. Let me explain why. The school had a policy that said you cannot disrupt. In fact, right before the event, the dean emailed a PDF of the policy to everyone. They were on notice. And you had an administrator come in and warn them and say, if you keep disrupting, something will happen to you. I think the school did everything they needed to lay the predicate for a discipline. Now, a discipline does not have to be expulsion. It could just be an admonishment. It could just be a warning, right? Maybe they have to, I don't know, take a class on free speech. That might be helpful. I don't know, right? I'm open to different ideas of what the punishment is. But I think at a certain point, schools do have to recognize that if they take no action, they green light this sort of behavior, right? If students know that nothing will happen to them for engaging in this behavior, they'll do it again and again and again. And that's where the problems arise. But again, even though I think they disrupted my speech, I would not favor punishing these kids. I would not favor writing a letter to the bar. I mean, that's an option. I don't favor that at all. For character fitness, I don't think that's appropriate here. I think that the students learned their lesson when they recognized that this person who they thought was this, next incarnation of David Duke wasn't exactly that. But this sort of thing happens not frequently, pretty infrequently, but it happens, and it's helpful to talk about it in a forum where everyone's sort of sitting quietly and nicely, and can ask me questions at the end, which I'll be happy to answer. All right, I will stop here and let my good friend Steve offer some of his thoughts, and then maybe we'll take some Q&A later. So thank you so much.
So as Professor Blackman said, I think if we were here discussing the Supreme Court's abortion jurisprudence or impeachment, you'd see a much more vigorous difference in our views. I am basically very much in sympathy with everything that Josh had said, and I use my 10 minutes or so to try to provide some larger context for this issue and what I think it tells us about universities generally. I mean, for one thing, the quote-unquote liberal position, the progressive response to the ostensibly conservative position, what's that about? I mean, I think free speech, sort of strong First Amendment values, larger issues of academic freedom have traditionally been regarded as liberal and progressive causes, and at least historically, there has been a much greater association between conservatism and censorship, and trying to suppress controversial or apparently dangerous ideas. Indiana University has a part of its history involves vigorously defending Alfred Kinsey's very controversial sexuality research in the 1940s and 50s against, as you can imagine, very conservative state legislatures and a very conservative state, and the defense of that on the basis of academic freedom, which is a strain of freedom of expression and this larger idea of a marketplace of ideas, is very much a part of that tradition. And all of you have different backgrounds. You may or may not have context for this or think that campus free speech is an important issue. I mean, I think it is. I mean, you were all here in December when there was a business school professor named Eric Rasmussen who who identifies as a conservative Christian. He's very politically conservative, and he tweeted some things, and in the past he has blogged some things that a lot of people found offensive and just in part kind of shallow and superficial, but misogynistic, homophobic, even racist. And there were many students as well as faculty who just thought it was entirely obvious that the guy should be fired, that he had no right to, without any proof that it had ever negatively affected his ability to be a teacher or how he treated students. Just on the basis of his having these views, many students and faculty thought it was perfectly appropriate to just fire him. Several years ago, probably before most of you were here, a prominent conservative intellectual speaker, scholar named Charles Murray was here. And there were, only because IU had, there was a very strong, even maybe a little overly intrusive police presence. They made sure, there were protesters, they were, banging the drums outside the Franklin Hall trying to drown him out. The event went off. Unlike some campuses, he wasn't deplatformed, but there was a lot of disruption, and certainly people might have hoped to prevent him from speaking as well. What's the root of this? If students today and many faculty as well have kind of lost sight of this old traditionally liberal idea of freedom of expression, the First Amendment protecting a marketplace of ideas, the idea that if we think certain ideas are wrong and unjustified, that they will simply lose out, that you can hear them and people will decide for themselves whether they think the Federalist Society's views are good policy or ACS's views are good policy, but it's a marketplace. We don't have to try to shout it down to prevent it. I think somehow we have lost sight of that idea. It may have something to do with the way people are being taught in high school or college today. When I say that, it makes me feel old to say whatever they're teaching you guys in college and high school these days is not giving you a sufficient appreciation for the theory of the First Amendment. I think one thing that we really do lose sight of that's important in something like constitutional law is to see individual rights, including constitutional rights, as neutral values. That is, if we're going to protect free speech for one person, we have to protect it for another. And I think we have gotten away from that idea. Universities increasingly seem to see their mission now as pursuing social justice as part of their mission. And if you see that as part of your mission, I think it goes hand in hand with the idea that I can say, well, no, there are some ideas that are just morally right and good and pure, and we should hear those ideas, but there are certain ideas that are morally bad and impure and dangerous, and so we should try to stamp those out. The traditional idea of a university, I've used this term before, has been that it is a marketplace of ideas, that it is a neutral ground, that it is a place where people can be free to experiment, either with controversial research like Alfred Kinsey was doing, which exploded a lot of taboos about sexuality, or with controversial ideas or disagreements, that a university, first and foremost, should be as neutral as possible, a place where as much as possible people where controversial ideas or ideas that don't have a lot of money-making potential in the marketplace or not even especially popular can still win out. I mean, I was one of the early people in the 1990s who went around talking about gay marriage before that was a thing, and when most people were actually skeptical of it and probably opposed to it. But I was grateful that I was welcomed into some law schools and by people who wanted to hear about that, who were at least interested in the debate. So I think it's important to preserve this idea that universities, yes, we need to value safety and diversity. We need to have a basic respect for people's humanity, but we can't let that take us away from this idea that a university should primarily be neutral to the ideas and the research and the speech and the teaching that's done within it, rather than the institution creating a sort of identity. CUNY, as I understand it, really does see itself as having a kind of social justice
mission statement.
Mission, and those are the kinds of lawyers that it is educating. IU has this slogan, you may have seen it on the back of buses or other places, IU is home. And I think that's a noble sentiment. On the one hand, it's meant to sort of signal belonging and an appreciation for diversity. But I also think, if you think about it, home is also a place where we expect to be sort of protected and insulated from things that might make us uncomfortable or might challenge us. It's a place where we pull our security blanket around us and put on our comfy pants and, want to be as much as possible, feel relaxed. Well, is that really the right way to think about a college campus? Where you're supposed to be challenged and pushed a little bit and exposed to new ideas, even ideas you might have thought were dangerous or unpleasant to you. So I worry that by this kind of consumerism behind something like the slogan IU is home, that once again we're not necessarily contextualizing for our students what the purpose of being at a great university like IU really is. I think this is a liberal idea because academic freedom depends on the idea that scholarly merit is judged according to objective criteria. Again, not according to political criteria. In response to the Eric Rasmussen thing, I wrote on Twitter how, I thought it was a shame that so many of my liberal, and I consider myself a political liberal, but so many of my liberal colleagues around the university couldn't be trusted with academic freedom, and they needed it as much or more than people like Eric Rasmussen, the people who are, writing endlessly about gender and race and class and so forth. Okay, that's fine, that's good, that's valuable, but the Republicans who control the Indiana General Assembly probably think the world doesn't need one more scholarly article or one more class about race, gender, ethnicity, identity, and so forth. And academic freedom protects the ability of those scholars to pursue their vision and to put the truth out that they think the world needs to know, regardless of what the woke members of the Indiana General Assembly might think. So once again, it's a neutral principle. If we're going to protect academic freedom, if we're going to protect freedom of speech, it needs to work both ways. If we're going to protect it for liberal ideas or progressive ideas against conservative attacks, then as a matter of just a first principle, it needs to be protected for the expression of conservative ideas against liberal attacks as well. I think that basically summarizes what I wanted to say. So we've got like 15 minutes or so. So I'd really, and I know Josh would too, just really like to have some dialogue about these issues.
Sure. I'll offer a couple of brief comments with some questions. I think Steve hit on a very important point. There was a time when college campuses were politically conservative. Now, if you had tried to go to this campus, say, in the 1970s or 60s and argue that the 14th Amendment protects the right to same-sex marriage, I think you'd probably been kicked off. You probably would have been ostracized, you've been protested, you've been shouted down. And yet today the view Steve holds a majority of the Supreme Court. We don't know what ideas will gain currency and which ideas will be rejected. And the only way to test this is allow people to speak. If someone had shut Steve up in the 90s and all the people like him, a Burgerfell may not have happened when and if it did, right? The reason why I think the conservative liberal issues have flipped is that today there's certain orthodoxies on liberal campuses that the conservatives are the outliers. They're trying to use the same tools that conservatives used a generation ago to silence speech. I think it's unfortunate. No surprise that today it's conservatives railing for free speech and not the other way around. I'm in the middle. I want everyone to speak. I can tell you that your ideas are dumb, but at least let me hear you first. And with that, let's hear your questions.
Oh, and whoever controls the FedSoc Twitter feed, thank you for the shout out.
I've actually basically quit Twitter. I would encourage you to do the same. About 2 weeks ago, I had an op-ed in the New York Times in the impeachment case, which Alan Dershowitz read from the Senate floor. Lovely. My mentions were like, oh my God, so bad that I have not checked my notifications in 2 weeks. I didn't want to look at them. So if they're on Twitter, just email it to me and I'll see it later. All right, let's take some questions. Yeah.
So there has been linkage between hearing offensive speech and increased levels of stress, which has led to the conflation of speech and violence. What position do you take on that, and how do you respond to the idea that some speech, if it's offensive enough, can be violence?
Steve?
So I'm in the middle of reading this book called The Coddling of the American Mind, and it's written by the head of a free speech political group, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Research and Education, and the co-author is a social psychologist. And I haven't gotten all the way through the book, and I've kind of set it down a few months ago, but as I recall, part of their argument is, yes, there is a psychological connection here, but they're arguing it is wrong, that somehow in their upbringing, once again, kids today, they're arguing there's something about the way the current generation of college students was raised and taught by their parents and their schools, broad generalization, I know, that has led them to what they describe as a sort of catastrophizing, like everything's a catastrophe, everything's a crisis. They have somehow been encouraged to believe that everything that they disagree with or makes them uncomfortable is dangerous. And their argument, so far as I have gotten through it in the book, is to simply say that's just wrong. Yeah, you can say that ideas are violence, that conservative hate does not equal whatever. But, if you rationally inquire, you have to go below the level of a slogan. I think, again, the idea of a university is predicated on the idea that it has to be pretty extreme for you to say an idea is actually dangerous. The cure for bad speech is more speech, or to just not show up and to ignore it, and eventually it'll go away if people don't like it. So, yeah, I think the phenomenon you mentioned is true. The question is, are we allowed to analyze when is it valid and to not just accept a bumper sticker like ideas I disagree with are inherently dangerous or, by definition, violence.
And I'll add, law school often requires you to be exposed to some very hard topics. In criminal law, you might study rape. In common law, we teach about slavery. We teach about abortion, right? In torts, you might have some sort of sexual assault. issues, sexual harassment. There are cases involving topics that are very unpleasant to learn about. I think students who want to be attorneys have an obligation to be exposed to this. I know there are some crim professors who will not teach rape as a matter of course, and that's their prerogative. But when that's not taught because for concerns about how students react, you now have generations of law students who've never learned that law. And you know that there will be criminal defense attorneys among you who might need to know that one day. There's a cost when you use the trauma argument to exclude topics from discourse. It can be taught responsibly. There are ways to do it irresponsibly, there are ways to do it responsibly. But I think that's better than avoiding it altogether. Yeah, that's fine. You're next.
All right, so I'll just speak up. So thanks for being here. I know that a number of states, Texas being one of them, have either introduced or passed legislation that aims to protect free speech on college campuses. I'm wondering, what do you make of the methodologies that the states have used in adopting such legislation?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I'm actually not a fan of this legislation, which might sound a little surprising. There are many bills which take different forms, but generally they put pressure on state universities to punish and discipline protesters. I think academic freedom cuts both ways. I think that universities should be able to preserve the freedom of their faculty, but also legislatures should have some a buffer zone, if you want to call it, between their management of the university. It gets into micromanagement. Where does that leave us? It's in a bad spot, because if universities do nothing, then people like me get silent. So I'm in a weird spot, but I think these forms of legislation, I think, probably go a little bit too far. But I'm sympathetic to their causes, and there are things universities can do and states can do, but I'm not in favor of the state dictating punishment policy. That's too specific. Yes, there's a question over there in the back.
Yes. Do you think that with the limitation of speech on campuses, that there's also a limitation being placed on nuance in various discussions, and that it's harder to get in a more complicated idea because there is this focus on what slogans we're going to include and what slogans we're going to exclude?
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking about it primarily from the teaching standpoint. I mean, I really do think it is more effective and interesting in the classroom when not everybody agrees on everything. I told the story today in con law. One of my favorite students was, he was like this, complete Second Amendment gun nut, but he was also the head of the Environmental Law Society. He was, unpredictable. I've had, Catholic former military guys who were very protective of a gay classmate who was coming out. And so I think it's nice to sort of appreciate that not everybody can be put in a box. And I have, when I've taught the abortion cases in family law, I've had students that I knew were social and religious conservatives, and I'd ask them after class, how come you didn't speak up? Why didn't you give your perspective on this? And they have said, we feel ostracized if we speak out with our views. So I think that ostracism, that silencing is real. So
how do you respond to them, Steve, when your students in your class tell you that? How do you respond to that?
I mean, these happen to be a couple of students. They've graduated now who I knew well enough to just, to kind of push back and say, no, you guys, you should speak up. And, I mean, I can't deny their own experience if they have felt ostracized by their peers. I think that's
So you think they weren't afraid of you retribution from you, they're afraid of retribution from their classmates?
That's what I have heard generally anecdotally, that people here have not really complained that the faculty are somehow have a strong bias. If there are conservative students, again, particularly religious conservatives, who feel that they can't say what they really think, it's because of their fellow students. So I think it makes the classroom a less interesting place when everybody has these kind of default, squishy, liberal sort of views on everything, rather than being willing to challenge and point out where something is wrong, or an angle I haven't thought of.
Yeah, if I can respond. I'm speaking out to a group of about 6 of you right here. I'm sure there are others who aren't here. You're only in law school once. After you graduate, you'll never again have the chance to think about ideas the way you do now. You'll be focusing on your legal practice. You'll be, one small area of law, you'll become an expert in it. This is your shot. Don't blow it, right? So if you're in a class with Professor Sanders or someone else and you have a chance to speak about your ideas, do it. And I promise you, if you have the idea, there are others with the same idea who are also afraid. And it takes one person to break that silence. And once the first person breaks the silence, it floods, right? Because, Johnny did it, Sally did it, I can do it also. So you're here once, right? YOLO, right? Do it right. You're here once. Make your ideas count at every juncture. You have experiences, you have thoughts that maybe Steve doesn't have, that your classmates don't have, and you're completely valid to articulate it. And if your classmates want to shame you and humiliate you, that's on them, right? You don't want to be that person's friend if they're going to attack you for the ideas you have. That's why I think Steve and I get along. We don't agree on much, but we can have a commonality of agreement that we're going to agree to disagree, and that's very, very powerful. So my advice to all of you is open your mouth and don't keep it shut.
And I think that's in part because, and I think lawyers are generally a little better at this, notwithstanding this, than some people, because I know that Josh's positions are reasoned, and he can cite precedents and make logical, legally reasoned arguments for his conclusions. I know that they're not just. Now, I'm sure he has his personal political convictions and views too, but when we, if we disagree about something, we argue in a way that lawyers are supposed to argue.
I agree. Thank you, Steve. Maybe another question? Yeah, in the back. Thank you. We can hear you.
My name is Rayanna Carroll. I'm a Lyle here. And I guess I just have a little bit of pushback on your last point about how if your classmates want to shame you, well, shame on them. I think in theory that's a really good point, but when you're in it, peer opinions of you place a whole lot of pressure on you, and especially when we're looking at free speech on college campuses, a very big place that is a problem is in undergraduate spaces, where this is the first time you're away from home, this is the first time you are confronting perspectives and cultures that are not your own. And so in that respect, I guess my question is, when you're looking at protesters who are speaking up and silencing those that would agree, they are unshackled because they're loud, they're a minority, but they're loud. And those that aren't protesting and want to hear someone speak, they're generally more constrained by civility or politeness or whatever else. And if you punish the protesters, that's more like a badge of honor to them, because then they've been validated in the fact that the man is so afraid that now they're going to punish you for it. Yeah. So my question is, what do you do as someone else? I mean, if you are, I don't think it's enough to say shame on them. What can you do as a culture, I think, to kind of push that a little bit more? How do you create the space where that's easy?
Well, there was a lot in that question. I'm going to try to unpack as much of it as I can. First point is I agree on the punishment. I think punishing them gives them exactly what they want. They want that badge of honor, right? They would say, we got punished, right? I think they would actually enjoy that sort of discipline. So that's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of punishment. The second part of the question is what should you do? This is a more bigger ethos point, but don't care what people think about you. I know it's easy to say that, but if you live your life always in judgment, if you live your life worried about what others will think and say about you, you're not going to have a very happy life. You're not going to have a meaningful life. This is deep philosophical advice that I've come to over the years, which it's hard to do. I have tenure, right? But I got here for a reason, right? This was that funny story. This protest came the day after my tenure vote. Completely, coincidental. But if you live your life seeking the approval of others, it will always be there, hanging, and people always have the authority over you. You need to be able to find a space where you don't need to rely on the judgment of others to have your own views. Easier said than done, Josh, right? I visit some law schools where students are applying for jobs. And if they know they put Federalist side in their resume, they may not get hired at certain firms. I know that happens. And I ask these people, do you want to work at a firm where you're going to be punished for your political views or your philosophical views? Is that a place where you're actually going to be happy, right? You're going to be in a class where your classmates may shame you for your views. Are those the people who you want to have in your corner if you ever need them? So the short point of it is, in life, surround yourself with those people who will allow you to thrive, and don't depend on the judgment of those who would want to destroy you the first chance they get, who will trample on you the first time you step the second out of the woke lane, right? Because you can never walk enough eggshells. You will always disappoint them. You can never be. I mean, even you watch these political campaigns. Even the candidates every now and then put their foot in their mouth, and they piss off some constituency somewhere. You can't keep everyone happy all the time. So I don't try.
I think it's a hard question because, I mean, each of us has our own individual tolerance for how much we need approval and support from our peers. I think Josh and I temperamentally, and because we both have tenure, it's easy for us to say we don't give a damn about what people think. But I mean, so part of it I think does come down to, though, we're talking about law school. So we're talking about arguing like lawyers. I mean, it's one thing to go around saying, I believe abortion is murder. And if you keep saying that in people's faces, maybe they're going to start, shunning you. It's another thing to get the reputation of being somebody who can make a really smart, nuanced critique of Roe versus Wade, or can point out that even Justice Ginsburg said Roe probably the time wasn't right for it. So again, if we're talking about being respected among peers for your mind and your ability to make arguments, as opposed to your sort of just opinions. So maybe that's one way of saying, when you state, I mean, one reason I said, as much as I supported Rasmussen's freedom of speech, I really don't respect him is his, this is the business professor, most of his stuff are just these sort of hit and run blog posts and tweets and all that. He has not developed his conservative critique of the academy in any sort of in-depth, rigorous way. And I think if he did, more people would respect him for it, even if they disagree with him.
Yeah, I think I agree with Rasmussen's bit kind of just fires off the hip. There's not much there, right? I mean, and the things he's speaking about are only tangential related to the thing he writes about also. So I think they're. But if you want, we talk after the event. But you ask a profound question. There's a lot going on there, but I can give my perspective. I gave the same answer before tenure. I never cared what people think about me. Maybe that's why I'm such an iconoclast. But in varying degrees. Seeking approval lets people control you, and it's not a healthy formula.
I think that's all the time that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you.